Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for continuing to follow and support the work of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, Southeast Europe's leading foreign policy think tank. Since our founding in 2013, we've been truly privileged to host in Belgrade and elsewhere myriad of really impressive intellectual figures, ranging from the likes of Niall Ferguson and Joe Nye to John Mearsheimer, Kevin Rudd, Ian Bremmer, Nouriel Rubini, Richard Haas, and many others. We organized conferences and interesting roundtables around the world. Most of them were held in Belgrade and New York, but also in Washington, Beijing, Istanbul, London, Paris, Kuwait, and many other parts of the world. The product that we are most proud of is the Journal of International Relations and Sustainable Development, which is our think tank's quarterly journal of foreign affairs. And the latest issue, the 16th volume of the journal, uh, we are launching today. It is a spring 2020 issue. We're launching it with a little bit of delay because of the developments in the world that I'm sure we're going to touch upon during this conversation. Originally, the volume was meant to be devoted to the Middle East, and then in February and March of this year, an asteroid, a proverbial asteroid, had hit the Earth in the form of COVID-19, and the world was brought to a virtual halt. The world economy is still going down, and much of the world is locked. So the main topic of the issue turned out to be, instead of the Middle East, on the pandemics and the geopolitics. And the subtitle is The Quickening. So is the world quickening whilst stalling? What is going on in the world, from America to Asia to all other parts of the globe? Tonight, I have a great privilege of debating this with two of the authors in the latest issue. The first one needs no long introduction because he's such a famous world figure for anyone who is following international relations and geopolitics, an old friend who visited us in Belgrade twice. We were, as CIRSD, hosting him twice. Um, he's currently chairman and also founder of Geopolitical Futures. Dr. George Friedman is a New York Times best-selling author. His latest book, The Storm Before the Calm, published in February, describes the periodical developments in the United States. But many of his previous books were translated into Serbian, and we have had the privilege, as I said, of hosting him in Belgrade twice. Uh, he has presided over the Stratfor, the company he founded back in the 1996. He presided over the company for about 20 years, but he at the helm of the Geopolitical Futures. He's a graduate of Cornell University. He holds a doctoral degree in government from Cornell University. And interestingly enough, our second guest is also Cornell University graduate with the same doctorate from Cornell, Professor Rawi Abdelal. He's currently Herbert F. Johnson Professor of International Management at Harvard Business School. He also directs Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Also a prolific author. I'm going to mention a few books. that he wrote, The National Purpose in the World Economy, The Rules of Globalization, Measuring Identity, and he's also an author of numerous other publications and articles, currently working on two big projects, one being The Fragile State of the World, and the other one, The Profits of Power, which explores the geopolitics of energy in Europe and Eurasia. This is surely going to be a very exciting discussion on world affairs. And I would love to start discussing the world affairs with the developments in the world's most powerful country, the world's most powerful nation, which is the United States. Both of you are from the United States. George sits in Texas, and Rawi sits in Massachusetts. But what we see as in outsiders is that America seems to be in a great turmoil. Uh, for the past few years, one could have talked about political crisis and institutional crisis in the United States, but literally, streets seems to be in fire. Something is going on in America. So I'm going to start off with George, who recently wrote a book on America. What is going on in America, George?
Local to American history. If we go back to the last one 50 years ago, it was the 1970s and late 1960s. It began in part with massive racial issues, including substantial violence. It went on to an extraordinary period of economic dysfunction, accompanied by the Arab oil embargo, as it was called. It was a troubled time. We were transiting from one phase to the other, one phase socially, one phase economically, where the internal combustion engine had driven everything. The microchip was now emerging. And the United States is an inherently disorderly place. Viewed from the inside, and not being as old as I am, it is a shocking thing to watch. Being as old as I am, I saw the murder of Martin Luther King. I saw the cities burning. I saw rage. I saw all these things. So to understand the United States and to go back to the 1920s and to go back further and further, we see this as early as Andrew Jackson. It is a process that we go through. We come out of it, but the more powerful we become in the world, the more frightening it becomes, because the world depends on a stable United States. And right now, we're not very stable. Right now, at the moment, it always starts with the basic contradiction of the United States. All men are created equal, and slavery, and blacks. And this is always the opening of it, because this is the insoluble problem for the United States. And it will go on to economic dysfunction and everything else. As to the COVID, it's no more predictable than the dust storms of the Great Depression. It's just one of those things that happens. But what's important to understand is that unlike much older countries, we were an invented country. The regime was invented, its principles were invented, even the population and the geography, in a certain sense, was invented. We are still very young, still developing, and so we're in chaos, and it's frightening. But on the other hand, we'll get out of it.
Well, thank you, George. Well, Rawi, the same question now from Massachusetts, from your view. What is going on in America, and how does this end, this current crisis?
Well, I think that even before the pandemic and the quarantine era began, the US economy faced a number of deep structural challenges. And one of them has to do with the place of the United States in the world economy. And we could say a lot about that, and perhaps we'll talk about the world economy. But to radically simplify some of the deep challenges, we could point to one piece of data, which is that the United States has a level of income inequality among its citizens at the moment that has not been as extreme as it is today since 1929. And so we've gone through these cycles of rising income inequality and then eras of a more even distribution of income. And so we're living at the moment at a peak of income inequality. And the last time we saw it was in the 1920s, which was also correlated with a wide variety of resentments and populist backlash against the system. And then if we just layer the pandemic and quarantine onto that fact of income inequality, you make note of the fact that Black Americans, African Americans, are disproportionately likely to develop severe illness or die from exposure to SARS-CoV-2, the virus itself. So people of color in the United States are dying at a much, much higher rate than white Americans are. And if you take every inequality that we had before the pandemic has basically magnified it. And so I'll just say one other word about that. I'm in my house in the suburbs of Massachusetts. Harvard University is still paying my salary, and everything I do from a computer at home. The number of people who are able to continue to earn money during quarantine is highly correlated with their place in the distribution of income, which is to say, poor people can't stay home and also earn money nearly as well as higher income people can stay home and continue to earn money. So take every inequality we have, racial inequality, economic inequality, the pandemic has magnified it and made it more grotesque even in some ways. And so I think that's an important part of this story.
So, George, well, thank you, Rawi. George, what about America's leadership right now in the world, America's engagement with the world? In the last few years, we saw America withdrawing from a number of treaties, a number of pacts, from the TPP to the climate treaty, several UN agencies, the latest one being the World Health Organization. In the middle of the pandemic, as a matter of fact. So, is this a strategic trend? Is America really withdrawing from the world, turning inwards, or is it just to do with this administration that might change as of next year, as a matter of fact?
In 1991, an extraordinary thing happened. For the first time in 500 years, no European power was a global power. The only global power was the United States. And this was an enormously uncomfortable position for the United States. Uncomfortable in the sense that we were founded as the first great anti-imperial enterprise, but also it was extraordinary. We had no idea how to be the power. We knew how to lead a wartime alliance. We were very good at that, or near a wartime alliance, but we weren't able to understand how to manage the world. And that came out in 9/11. In 9/11, we did not know how to manage this situation. Our responses came from the Cold War, that we had to deploy massive troops, and we came into the insane situation of deploying divisions to fight small terrorist groups. And what's happening here is we've realized that that is an absurd thing. I mean, we talked about being in the sandbox for, this is the way we put it, for the long war. Well, that's pointless. The United States at this point is doing something very important. It's defining the national interest. Now, since we're the United States, we will do that as an opera, at the top of our lungs, making accusations in all directions and everything. That's our culture. But the basic is not world leadership. I mean, you can't lead a herd of cats. The real issue is what precisely is the American interest? And part of that is a stable world to the extent that it's attainable. But what do we need? So one of the things that has emerged, whether from the Trump administration or wherever, is this idea that We do not have an overriding interest in the Middle East. We have some peripheral interest, but no core interest. Our core interest is dealing with China and Russia. Now, we still define our interests in terms of conflict, which is part of the maturing process. But as I see what the United States is doing is something that took Britain a century to do, and the Romans 2 centuries. And it was a mess. And it's because we are in this situation where, China may be powerful, but it can't operate in the Atlantic Ocean, and it can't operate in the Mediterranean, and it's not going to. And it's the U.S. is trying to understand what it means to be in this position. Now, when the world speaks of American leadership, it usually means they want something from America, and America should give it to them. So leadership has become a loaded notion, in my mind at least. We are in this transition, and we have a regime, a government, that represents the chaos that's within the American soul at this moment. It's not altogether alien, nor is the rage from all sides. But we have to emerge into it. And it reminds me of Britain in the 18th century, when it was defeated by a third world power, had no idea what to do about it, the third world power being the United States. It had no idea what to do with it. It had to go through economic crises in the 1820s and everything else to begin to have a model. We have no model. And the model that most of the world wants to impose on us is the one that benefits them. And we're not going to do that. So that's where I see this coming from.
So, Rawi, I'm going to ask you a very hypothetical question, but we're staying with America. We're staying with American leadership. So, imagine somebody asks you to write a policy recommendation to the next American president. You don't know who the next president is going to be. Could be Donald Trump, could be Joe Biden, could be someone else. We live in a really crazy world, and 3 4 months is a very long time these days. But anyway, you're asked to write a policy memo that is to be opened on January 20 of next year in the White House by the next president, and you have 3 bullet points to fulfill. 3 things that you would recommend to the next American president to do. What are the 3 things that you would put in that envelope?
So, what an interesting question. I will leave aside for the moment the possibility that the upcoming election in November might not definitively decide the outcome that you're describing. I think that there's increasingly a not unrealistic chance that either side, whether the left or the right, does not accept the results of the election as legitimate, especially if we move toward remote voting. So competing claims about voter suppression and voter fraud. So leave aside that nightmare constitutional crisis scenario and assume that there is some legitimate president occupying, not literally occupying in that sense, but residing within the White House.
Residing within the White House.
Yeah. I would say, I would urge to consider 3 facts. One is we are facing the very real possibility of the end of the West as a geopolitical concept, of a rupture in the transatlantic alliance, which is one of the key foundations of a wide variety of elements of order in the world, including one of the institutional foundations for globalization itself. But even more broadly, in terms of the international politics of the world, the fact that there has been a relatively unified West, a transatlantic relationship, has been extremely useful to the United States, and it is in danger of being destroyed. Second, I would say that on balance, an era of well-integrated global markets has benefited the United States. And this era of globalization is itself under threat, primarily from within the West and a kind of populist backlash against globalization. And that populist backlash in the United States and in other places has a lot to do with income inequality, but it also has to do with feelings of indignity that many Americans have. in their place in the economy. And so if the United States wants to preserve globalization, then it must produce a more manageable distribution of dignity among American workers, which has something to do with money, but a lot more to do with the meaning and purpose that people find in work. And then the third issue I would describe in my memo is that the adoption of a stance of geopolitical rivalry with China will produce that outcome. And I do not think there's anything inevitable about rivalrous tension between the United States and China. They're bound to bump into one another in a wide variety of ways in global politics. But that the relationship is bad is not determined by the balance of power. That's determined by strategy and policy. So the 3 points on my memo would be to try to restore the transatlantic relationship, to try to reimagine the American economy so as to produce a desirable distribution of dignity among workers, and to try to imagine a world of not necessarily engagement, not necessarily cooperation, but of a kind of strategic conversation and dialogue with China that is not necessarily one filled with tension.
George, how about the last point that Rawi raised, the geopolitical rivalry or relationship that could be one of strategic dialogue, competition, whichever way you want to describe it. Do you think that there is an inevitability of a harsh geopolitical rivalry of the United States and China in the 21st century? And is there anything that that America can or should do, as a matter of fact, to try to avoid it?
Well, I've never seen a century without a harsh rivalry. That doesn't mean it has to be with China. The thing that I would say is, in 1991, our relationship with the West and the West's relationship with us shifted. The foundation of that relationship only emerged in 1945, and it was basically military. The Marshall Plan, European integration as it wanted, was an element of the grand strategy against the Soviet Union. Now, the fundamental institution of that relationship was NATO. We're not a member of the European Union. We have different relations with various European countries and have always had that. But at this point, the glue that held it together, which was a common interest that was clear, and it wasn't economic, it was a common interest in protecting the West, really has shifted. The question here is, for example, when we do NATO, the European accusation is that we've abandoned NATO. The counter accusation is they abandoned NATO. NATO is a military alliance. To have a military alliance, you must have a military. One view of what Europe has done is essentially accepted the idea of collective security while not building the tools of collective security. Not irrational on their part, but not necessarily in the American interest. The economic dimension, of course, is important, but we have to remember something about the United States. It lives on an island, North America, and the collective GDP of the three countries that make it up is slightly larger than the EU's. Not enough to make much of a difference, but it's very large. The EU is a large, fractious entity where if you go to Poland, you see one side of it. You go to Portugal, you go to see another side of it. And it's very hard to say what the West is when we need Europe. Europe is in the process of trying to define whether it is a single entity or a series of independent nations. The United States is in the process of trying to balance itself in the world. Now, as to China, I see China as much less powerful than other people do, and I may be wrong, but my vision of them is that they are terrified of an American blockade. The South China Sea for them is a nightmare, because if the United States chose to blockade, those outer islands would be perfect choke points. And they actually run all the way up to Japan. It's not clear that the United States wouldn't do this. The United States has done reckless things before. So from the Chinese point of view, getting the United States out, the thing to watch is they have failed to do that. Their military power, their naval power is limited. Their economic power is more substantial, but it is a divided country. The American interest is not to lose control of the Pacific. We bled for the Pacific. The Chinese interest is not to be blockaded. This can be worked out. And the interesting thing to me, aside from what I thought was a poorly thought out tariff program, we've had very little competition. In fact, we were allies of China during the Cold War. In 1973, Nixon, the monster of that time, went to China and we pulled together. So we have four powers. We have Russia, to the extent it still has that power, China, to which it's emerging, and Europe, which is indefinable. And from my point of view, and this is where I guess I disagree, I see the Western relationship as from 1945 to 1991. And then it went flittering off. Now, forming an alliance with the Europeans is a very complex and difficult thing, as Serbia has learned. Which Europeans are you talking about? And so I talk about this Western alliance as a Euro-American alliance, and I see great difficulty on the other end. That said, I absolutely agree that a confrontation with China is not only irrational, but unnecessary. China isn't challenging our fundamental interests. We can find a basis of doing that. I am far more concerned about what Europe is going to be, because I don't understand, and I don't think they understand what they're going to wind up being.
Rawi, this is a very interesting point where I can pick on your Russia's expertise in Russia, because George mentioned Nixon and the Cold War, and today there seems to be a harshening rivalry, and it may not be one leading to a war, as George said, but one can reasonably expect that regardless of the outcome of the American election in November, that this competition is going to continue, perhaps at a different pace, perhaps slightly more reasonable than it is today, but it is going to continue in all likelihood. Now, can you imagine the next president of the United States trying to do an inverse Nixonian gesture or a trip to Moscow to try and get Russia on the side of the Western alliance defined by George as being a Euro-American one?
In a word, no. I think there was a moment when such a relationship with President Putin could have emerged, and President Putin was clearly open to that at several moments early in his presidency and felt, for a variety of reasons, betrayed by the United States and by the West. And so from that perspective, it is too late. I would also say that the current situation serves a variety of domestic political objectives, which is to say, we can't actually have a productive rivalry with China. It's too big in the world economy. We can have in the United States a politically productive rivalry with Russia because it's small in the world economy. Russia accounts for about 1.5% of world GDP, and that is declining. Russia is not a rising power. Russia is a declining power. And so the stakes are limited, and it is useful for Russia to have this imagination that it's a great rival of the United States, when in fact, that's not a realistic depiction of Russia's place in the US national interest. And then finally, I would say that the next president, whoever he is, has very limited authority to try to reset relations with Russia. And this is one of the complications of the sanctions regime, about which I wrote in your journal. Most of the sanctions against Russia are memorialized in law. They're not mostly executive order. So no president can undo the sanctions regime. And without undoing the sanctions regime, it's impossible to create a more harmonious US-Russian relationship. And the sanctions regime is essentially only going to be undone by acts of Congress. And I don't know what lunatic in Congress would decide one day that he or she would propose on the floor of the House or the Senate that today's the day we're going to relax sanctions on Russia. Let's all get behind this. There's no political interest in doing that. So I think we have a kind of semi-permanent difficulty as a result of the way the sanctions were put into law. And I think finally, I already said this was my last point, but just one last little issue, which is this question of Russia's putative interference into US politics really, I think, reflects some of the underlying chaos that George described. So if we think about the ways in which those points of interference manifested themselves, what actually happened was that somebody connected to the Russian government put nonsense on social media, on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and then Americans spread the nonsense to each other on those same social media platforms. And it's really a much deeper vulnerability we're describing. Americans have decided not to agree on what's true and what's not true. Like, we don't agree on facts anymore, much less on policies. And that is an incredibly deep vulnerability for anyone in the world to exploit by putting nonsense on our social media platforms.
That is very interesting. I think we're gonna go back to that if we have time when we address the state of democracy in the world in the context of this new information age. But before that, I want to ask George about the world economy, about his predictions for the world economy. You wrote recently about the similarities between the current period and the period of 100 years ago, when the world was roughly 100 years ago, when the world was entering a Great Depression. And essentially, back then it was triggered by a shock in demand. Europe destroyed itself through the First World War, and then the rising industrial power producing cheap products and selling them to Europe was the United States. And suddenly the demand was gone, and there was a depression. Now, in today's world, fast forward 100 years down the road, and we have China, in a way, being what United States was about 100 years ago. And all of a sudden, a huge shock in demand, perhaps even greater than 100 years ago, comes, and it comes in the form of COVID-19. So is the world facing a Great Depression again, or is it just going to be a very nasty recession that we're currently going through?
Well, to me, the difference between a recession and depression is this. A recession is a cyclical financial event that is part of the business cycle and can become more extreme or compounded, what have you, as that. The depression actually destroys businesses, destroys jobs, as we've seen in the US airline industry. It isn't there, and it won't be there again in the same way. The United States, and this is a point I do want to make, we were the China of 1900, the massive producer of low-cost goods that swept the Europeans. And World War I shattered us eventually because we lost our markets. And Smoot-Hawley was an interesting thing that we did to try to compensate for this. But we've had only one in industrialism moment like this, which was really a depression that began in 1914 and then in 1955. And I say that because the post-World War II period, World War I period continued up till close to the beginning of the war. In England, things were not well. Uh, and then after World War II, we had a depression from Japan to Britain. Economies were vastly destroyed. This was compounded by natural events, but we've never seen one that I can think of outside of the Black Plague, which I don't really understand, how it developed. So we can't predict it. The crucial issue here is that the solution that has been found by medicine, the only one they can use, is to withdraw labor from the market. In land, labor, and capital, labor is rarely the one that's withdrawn. In this case, it is, along with demand. Now, the question really is, how long does this last? And it's becoming apparent that the only thing that will make it stop is either accepting the disease, the consequences, or a vaccine. And a vaccine is unlikely before the end of the year. And we're sitting here trying to calculate the incalculable. How long before the economy destroys itself in the United States, before it becomes inviable, can't revive? And we don't know. But this is the great danger. And this is where geopolitics really ends. We can talk about the consequences that are potentially there, but it is very difficult to understand the world we're in. We have very little precedent except war, and this is not quite that.
So
That's a good way of
I'm going to
saying,
ask
I don't know.
Rawi, very, very, very elaborate way of saying no, but Rawi, you are part of this project, Fragile State of the World, and you're trying to draw parallels, if I understand well, between the first globalization that took place between 1870 and 1914 with the second wave of globalization that started off in 1989, 1990. And now we have this COVID tragedy and everything that George was describing. We also have the acceleration of political and geopolitical rivalries. So, do you think that today the world is going in the opposite direction? Are we, for the first time, deglobalizing this world? Is this trend, first of all, is it happening in your view? And if it is happening, is this going to be a temporary state phase, or do you see a longer term trend in worlds decoupling technology, economy, and in other ways?
So my sense is that the world began conceptually deglobalizing at least a decade ago, if not longer, and then actually putting policies into place that pushed forward a process of deglobalizing before the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. So, and especially a kind of populist backlash in Europe and in the United States to globalization. Americans don't like globalization. The French don't like globalization. A majority of French citizens, a majority of American citizens think globalization is a force for bad, which is why President Trump is not an accident of history. He's a manifestation of a collection of politics and economics. So I think globalization was in trouble before, and the pandemic has just made all of that vastly, vastly worse. And so, insofar as that current cycle of globalization was already ending, I think SARS-CoV-2 is just accelerating its end. Nothing lasts forever, right? The last era of globalization didn't go away forever. Eventually, there was a new era of globalization rebuilt. But certainly, and I'm not in the business of predicting the future, and I'm not good at it, but certainly it does not seem that in the next decade or so, we're going to be able to restore enthusiasm for globalization among societies in Europe and in the United States. And if we don't restore the enthusiasm, then we won't have the political will to help produce it. So there will be another era of globalization after this one ends. And I hope that this one ends not as badly as the last one ended. And I hope it does not take as long to rebuild a kind of political consensus in favor of it. But I think we need to stop thinking about whether we're going to save this era of globalization. It's too late. I think we need to begin to think about
Mhm.
what a new global economy might become.
You say you're not in the business of predicting the future, but George, in a way, is. He predicts the next decade. He predicts things about the next 100 years, and then a thing like COVID happens. So George, two questions. Has COVID-19 fundamentally changed your predictions for, say, the next decade in the world? And particular question, because we are in Europe, I mean, we in Serbia are in Europe. What is your prediction for the next 10 years when it comes to Europe?
Well, for the United States, my prediction was a period of instability, deep unhappiness, social dysfunction. COVID puts it on steroids. I mean, it doesn't change it. The question is, do we come out of it? And what do we look like when we come out of? We speak of globalization. Nothing has broken globalization more than the COVID virus. Uh, at this point, the Europeans are going to start barring Americans from traveling there, just as a symbol of what that is. What I see as the fundamental problem of Europe, assuming COVID goes away, is deciding the relationship between national sovereignty and the European Union. This is a treaty organization, and in this treaty, national sovereignty is said to reside with the individual nations and their governments, not with Brussels. In watching what happened with Brexit from a geopolitical point of view, Britain, as part of a treaty, is the second largest economy in Europe. It chose to have a different relationship. Brussels made it as difficult as possible. Now, Poland and Hungary are under attack, very different countries, and they may not be liked. But the question that has to be answered by Europe is, to what extent does Brussels define what is possible for Europe, and to what extent do the nation states and their publics define it? And this is a very, very difficult thing, because when EU was founded, there was a consensus about what it should be. It was founded at the same time that the Soviet Union collapsed. And the same liberal notion of what should be. Well, Eastern Europe has evolved in a different way. Southern Europe is Southern Europe, and Northwest Europe is Northwest Europe. When we talk about Europe, that's merely a continent. There are those who talk of Europe as if it were a political entity. There are others who talk of Europe as if it was a treaty they're part of. So I think for you, the stability of Europe really depends on a clear definition and consensus, if possible, as to what it means to be European.
So, Rawi, you recently visited Serbia, if I'm not mistaken. You were a speaker at the Koponik Forum earlier this year. So, you had a chance to learn about Serbia, about the state of Serbian economy, and now all this has changed as a result, in many ways, has changed as a result of the COVID crisis. We also recently had a few days ago, as a matter of fact, we had elections which yielded a parliament that has no representation of the opposition in it. So we have a very, very uh, strong autocratic government. And this government has basically a very, very wide maneuvering space when it comes to economic measures. So if there's one good thing, I personally don't think that there are too many good things about the current political situation in Serbia, but leave that aside for a second. If you were to write, I'm going to ask you that for another policy memo, a one pager, three things memo that you would recommend to the Serbian government to do under the circumstances when it comes to its economic policies amidst this global conundrum, what would that memo contain?
I'm going to simplify my memo from three measures into one, if I may.
Please.
I I think that we are living through an interesting transformation of elements of national competitiveness in the global economy or in a regional economy. And the advantages of having a large domestic market are not what they once were, not what they once were in the 20th century, not what they once were in the 19th century. The advantages of being large are likely to turn into disadvantages as we think about elements of the digital transformation of the economy. You think about the replacement of human effort by the effort of robots or computers. It is not clear what everybody's going to be doing with their time in a productive, income earning, and dignified way as a result of this. So if I were China, I would be terrified of the digital transformation of the economy because it changes the relationship between what labor can contribute with mere human effort and what's required in terms of intellectual and technical skills. And that means that there are advantages to being small as long as there's a coherent strategy for recrafting the skill set of the nation to take advantage of the opportunities of this digital transformation, which means rethinking how Serbia educates its children, rethinking how it conducts vocational training for people, rethinking the wide variety of ways in which a society can collectively contribute to its economic development. And so the one point on the memo would be to develop a strategy for the digital transformation of the economy and of education and of work, and to take advantage of the new advantages of being remote and being small.
Thank you, Rawi. The same question to George, and that's going to be the last question in this section before moving on to the questions from the audience. What would you recommend to Serbia, George?
Well, I would recommend to Serbia the same thing I would recommend from a policy point of view to anyone else. We are about to undergo a dramatic demographic shift that will, I think, in some ways overawe the microchip. And I say that because life expectancy is expanding dramatically. Birth rates are contracting dramatically. I see no arrestor to this because the cost of having children is high and medicine is advancing. So we are moving into a period where there will be more older people than younger people. It already is happening in many places, where the political structure will be driven not by those who are driving creativity, but those who are preserving it. And also those who are the highest consumers of medical products and so on. So if that problem really arises, and it's arising in the United States and in other places, and we can see it in the COVID crisis to some extent, we are undergoing a social event that I can't find a precedent for. Now, it may be that here the microchip, which is what I call the technological revolution we had, and the biological evolution may well find a place to nest with each other. But to me, the most startling thing is the decline of birth rates, not the extension of life expectancy, and the fact that we had better do something about degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, because now it can become an economy wrecker. That worries me. And what worries me the most is that we're diverted to nonsense at a given moment and must align our technological things with the problems we're facing.
Well, thank you to both. And we're now going to switch to the section where I'm going to ask you the questions that we collected from the social networks and sent to us by our members, most of whom are students from the whole region. So the first question goes to Rawi, and this is a question from Maya. She is from Zagreb. Will the US dollar keep its primacy by the end of this decade? And how serious is going to be the challenge to it by Chinese currency, potentially electronic one?
Well, that's a great question. And I'll uh, say again that I don't want to make any claims about the future. There are always multiple possible futures, and we have agency over which one we will get, in my way of thinking about it. Having said that, it is hard to imagine a possible future in the next decade in which the dollar is replaced as the reserve currency for the world, primarily because there is no alternative yet, as much as people despise the dollar-based system. And they despise the dollar-based system for lots of good reasons, including the sanctions, which we discussed before, the fact that the United States uses unilateral extraterritorial sanctions that prevent companies that violate those sanctions from engaging in dollar-based transactions or touching the US financial system at all is quite reasonably infuriating for lots of people in the world. But a reserve currency has to be freely traded. There has to be issued by a sovereign that does not control the flow of capital in and out of the country, and has to be settled within a very large liquid market for debt securities denominated in that currency. And China's currency has none of those characteristics now, and it's hard to imagine the Chinese currency having those characteristics in the next 5 or 10 years. The days of the dollar will eventually come to an end, just as the days of the pound sterling came to an end. This is a natural rhythm of geopolitics and economics. When the United States is no longer the world's most important economy, then the dollar will no longer be the most important currency for how the financial system works. But it's hard to imagine that happening by the end of this decade. A lot would have to change within China. And those are changes that China is not looking to undertake at the moment. But it's a great question.
Thank you very much. The second question goes to George. It's Anna from Belgrade. She asks, was COVID-19 the biggest black swan of your career? And what else of that sort of magnitude might happen in the next 10 that would have the same impact on the world?
By definition, a black swan can't be predicted. I don't know, but I certainly never expected this. So I would say that I grew up prepared for a nuclear war that would have been far more catastrophic, but never happened. And really, we did grow up prepared for that war. We expected as children and as adults. We never expected a disease like this. We had enormous confidence in our medical establishment. We had an enormous belief that a disease would come along and they would be able to solve it. The shock to the system, I think, is going to be in the end that the medical system was not prepared for this. That the advice they gave, which was the only advice they could give, this was not their fault, was sequestering yourself. So will it happen again? I mean, the question that I really have that I don't understand is, how did this happen? All right, how did it emerge? And I don't think the Chinese did it, so that's out of the question. But how does this happen? And in my science fiction mind, is this the first of a wave of these diseases, for which I have absolutely no knowledge or expectation? But if you read good science fiction, which is the apocalyptic science fiction, it's the only thing that gives you a basis for understanding what's going on. Dr. Fauci confuses me.
Question for Rawi. NS from Sarajevo is asking you, which aspects of our everyday life or work, if any, will never go back to pre-COVID-19 normal?
Never. I mean, the word "never" makes me reach for my wallet. That makes me nervous, and so I'll I'll try not to use the word "never" in my answer, although I understand the nature of the question and the trying to imagine what things were like before that seem unlikely to persist after the end of the pandemic, which will eventually end. For as George said, and I agree, there will either be a vaccine or this will just be one more risk with which we live. Having said all of that, the transition to remote work or work from anywhere, which is not exactly the same thing, right? So remote work is you live near where your work is and you're just not always in your office. And work from anywhere is you can do your job from literally anywhere in the world. That digital transformation of work, which was a slow moving process before and happened more or less in a couple of months this year, I think is going to, it makes it hard for me to imagine that work will mostly be conducted by people who go to big office buildings every day and sit at a desk and do their work, or go to a factory every day and stand or sit and do their work there. I think that this is a semi-permanent change, if not simply a permanent change, that we will rethink what work is as a result of having been obliged to experience the positive and negative elements of working from somewhere else other than in an office with other people. So we're not going to go back, I think, anytime soon to mostly thinking of work as a thing that happens at a place with lots of other people.
Thank you. George, the question for you from Ishtwan from Subotica. For how long America is going to stay the world's most powerful nation, and who will be the next one?
Well, great power doesn't dissolve overnight. When we look at what has to happen, I mean, British power was destroyed in 2 world wars and then took decades to really retreat into something they could hold. Byzantium did not collapse in your neighborhood very quickly, okay? So the idea that the massive, assuming COVID is solved, okay, that the massive economic structure of the United States, the massive military power, the things that go into power, will suddenly dissolve and be replaced by someone. Well, this at the very least is a decades-long process. And that goes back to the question on the dollar. The reserve currency is the one you're willing to sign a 5-year contract denominated in. If you're willing to sign it in a yuan, by all means, it's a reserve currency. People want dollars because they have sufficient trust in it, and that in turn comes back to the power of the nation state that you're dealing with. So from my point of view, the currency is the outward manifestation of geopolitical power. Because anyone is free to take any currency that they want. But I've been to Belgrade, and they like dollars in the taxi cabs very much, and they're very happy to take them. I don't know if they would take yuan.
Got it. Rawi, question from Alexander from Niche. Who is the world's strongest leader today?
Wow. Well, there are lots of ways to try to answer that question, and I'm not sure I know how to answer any of them. I suppose the way I would try to answer that question is the leader in the world who has the most resources within his or her nation to use to project force or develop economic capabilities or pursue national interests, and who simultaneously is able to marshal those resources. So one example I would say is President Trump really can't be considered the strongest leader, even though the United States is the strongest nation, because he doesn't seem to be able to marshal those power resources that exist within the nation. So the president of the United States could be the person who is the right answer to this question, but I don't think this president is capable of marshaling those national resources. So then you have to think, what are the other countries that have sufficient national resources and sufficient capabilities to create a kind of domestic consensus to project those power resources into the world? And I guess that has to be Xi Jinping in terms of that combination of a considerable resource of national power and the capability of actually projecting that power into the world. It could be the United States. It just happens not. It could be the U.S. president. It just happens not to be the U.S. president right now. Interesting.
Could
Uh,
I take a shot at that?
please do. George, who is the
I
world's
regard
strongest
Xi,
leader today?
well, certainly not Donald Trump. I agree entirely with that. Xi, I think, is much weaker than he looks. He's had massive failures. The tariffs that were placed against him, I mean, his basic job is to manage the president of the United States, and he couldn't. Hong Kong, uh, the Xinjiang disaster, public relations disaster. There must be those on the Central Committee who are asking some serious questions about him. The one that impresses me the most is Modi. Modi has managed his way through this and has managed to attract a tremendous amount of the supply chain in a very short time to India. Now, you would not expect him to be able to do that, but he did. He's also happily engaging the Chinese in combat in a meaningless place, so it doesn't matter. But I'm watching Modi uh, accumulate power that he shouldn't be easily accumulating. So I think we should all watch the Indians. This may be their move, and I think Modi is the man overseeing it with the power to oversee it. So my difference is not Z, Modi.
Modi. That's very fascinating because both of them are Asian leaders. Uh, George, the last question for you, and it comes from Ivan from Belgrade. What is the next big war? Who is going to fight it, and by what means?
I'm not sure that the period of big wars isn't over. Okay, the Russians are very concerned about their borderlands, the Baltics, Belarus, Ukraine. They have come to reasonable understandings of what's going to happen. The Chinese cannot fight the US Navy at sea, and we certainly cannot invade China. I mean, that's never going to happen. Okay? So when you look at the great powers, it's not that they're not interested in war, but from a military standpoint, their ability to execute it, given geography, is very limited. So I'm beginning to think very strongly that really 1945 ushered in where systemic wars are not going to take place because of technology partly, uh, the complexity and the size of nations. I mean, the Europeans could go to one side of a country to another in a week. You can't possibly do that with the countries we're dealing with here. We may be looking at a period of spasmodic wars, near wars, but I don't see among the nations that we have now how they wage war against each other. I don't think the United States can. I don't think they can.
Thank you, George. And the last question goes to Rawi, and it's from Zoran. He's also from Belgrade. Uh, I'm 22 and I'm just out of college with a degree in economics. I have no job. I'm being offered a scholarship to go to Beijing for a 2 years master's course in the Belt and Road Studies. Should I take it?
Huh. Well, there's not an obvious career path from a master's in Belt and Road Studies. On the other hand, if we're comparing the possibility of spending 2 years almost certainly learning some Mandarin and making sense of how the Chinese economy functions. And if we're comparing this to unemployment, it sounds like a pretty grand adventure to undertake. So I, it always makes me nervous when people ask my advice because, like, my career is mostly accidental, and so like I have no idea how people set out to cause things to happen, other than choosing interesting adventures and letting them take you to unexpected places through a circuitous path. This sounds like a plenty good adventure to undertake, even if it's not like a grand plan.
Well, thank you very much, Rawi, and thank you very much, George. It was a fascinating discussion. I truly enjoyed it. I
Next time in
very much
Belgrade.
hope that I very much hope that you're going to be next time. I was about to say that next time in Belgrade physically. I could
Yeah.
only wish you a virtual welcome to Belgrade time. It will be George's third and your second, if I'm not mistaken. I would
Mhm.
very much like that we repeat this in front of the physical audience in Belgrade once this crazy COVID crisis is over. Please know that you have an open invitation as soon as the conditions are met. Thank you both, gentlemen, and all the best for now. We stay in touch and keep following the horizons.
Thank you very much for the kind
Thank you.
invitation, Vuk. Anytime.
And I agree.
Thanks, George.
Who would pass who would pass 2 years in China? There is no downside.
Thank you, gentlemen. All the best.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye.